Hey, good evening, everybody. I am Dr. Mike Totola, and welcome to Prime Time with Dr. Mike Totola. And what is Prime Time? Prime Time is a clever play on words, as you will see later, for a product, a next generation all ceramic material that I want to introduce to you in a little bit, and then talk about cementation protocols for that material and some other materials in the same type of class of material. So, starting about 10 years ago in direct restorative materials, we had to kind of choose between strength and aesthetics. And it reminds me of Beauty and the Beast. And in this case, IPS Emax, which launched back in 2007, was beauty. You can see Belle in that picture, the headstrong young girl who lives in the castle. And then in 2009, Bruxer, solid zirconia, was introduced. And that was the Beast. And as you can see, the Beast in that picture, he or it appears to be a werewolf on steroids. It's a little scary. I watched this movie probably 200 times with my daughters growing up, and I got scared. I didn't know how literally they were going to take it. They're both adults now and both married within their species to humans, so it all turned out okay. So we've always kind of had this beauty versus strength, and pick which one you want. And when we look at classes of materials for indirect restorative materials, we're going to start at the top with a couple. You see hybrid ceramic resin materials and hybrid materials. These are largely chairside CAD/CAM materials. So if you have a CAD/CAM system, you're familiar with those. But the next three are the ones where dentists have the most experience. These are the glass ceramics. So feldspathic ceramics, this is PFM porcelain. You could also make feldspathic veneers on their own. Very, very translucent, but also the weakest ceramic material that we have in dentistry. And then stronger than that was lucite reinforced feldspathics. And then stronger than that was lithium disilicate, and the new entries to the market, the lithium silicate market. So those are the three glass ceramics. And then on top of that, we had zirconia. Zirconia is not a glass ceramic. It doesn't have any glass in it. And we'll talk more about that later. And so when we look at all ceramics, we can also group them into low strength and high strength. So the two low strengths, one would be the feldspathic and the lucite reinforced, and those of course have to be adhesively bonded into place. And we would look at high strength all ceramics, that would be lithium disilicate and zirconia, and those are high strength. Those can be cemented, but I'm going to hopefully make a compelling argument for why those at times should be adhesively bonded and the best way to do it. So that's kind of the landscape as we have it today. And here's a couple of product names just to, I know dentists, including myself, have an easier time kind of when we see product names of knowing which ones which, because most dentists will know the name of a product before they know what it is. In fact, if we called 100 dentists right now and ask them if they've heard of IPS Emax, they know what Emax is, but maybe half of them would know it's lithium disilicate, for example. So brand names are important when talking products to dentists so they can understand what's going on. And so that's just some of the representative names of those different classes of materials. You probably prescribed at least the bottom four at one point in the last few years. And we have this kind of balance that we try to work out, this Beauty and the Beast balance, and that is strength and translucency exist in an inverse relationship to each other when it comes to indirect restorative materials. So the more translucent or beautiful a material is, the weaker it is, kind of by definition. And so as you look up and see translucency going towards the top with the hybrid ceramic resins, and then you come all the way down where the strength is the highest to zirconia, and that's where we have the least amount of translucency and the least amount of aesthetics, but the highest strength. And by the way, if you want CE credit at the end of this, there is going to be 6 questions that you take, and I'll try to point out the questions for you. And I'm not a betting man, but if I were, I would bet there would be something on one of the questions about zirconia's higher strength and less translucency on the test. That's kind of the hallmarks of that material traditionally. And so I mentioned lithium silicate too. So we've had lithium disilicate, IPS Emax, since 2007, performing very well. Dentists absolutely love that material. Now all of a sudden we have lithium silicate, and dentists always say, what's the difference? And I'm like, one silicate, you idiot. Did you fail math? But to me, the stranger thing is, if you're going to be one silicate different, for God's sakes, do lithium trisilicate. I mean, you never see Gillette release like a razor with one less blade. It's always one more. So For some reason, companies have come up with lithium silicate. And as you see a couple of the brands listed here, I want you to look at the chart below it and see that that IPS Emax, for example, is 70% lithium disilicate and 0% lithium silicate. And then Celtra Duo's 6.5 to 11%, and Suprinity's 12 to 18%. And then Obsidian is all lithium silicate as its main ingredient. And you might ask yourself, well, why is this important? And it's important because it not only has to do with strength, but more importantly, fracture toughness. So flexural strength is the numbers that you see in pretty much all the journals or advertisements talking about typically zirconia, you know, and if it's a 3Y material, we'll define that a little later. It's 1100 to 1200 megapascals of flexural strength, and that's just breaking a bar in a machine. Fracture toughness is much more clinically relevant. This is where you take a sample, you put a crack in it, and then you lean on it until it fractures. And this is clinically relevant because it replicates what happens in the mouth, where a small fracture might be introduced into a crown. Maybe it's from us as dentists adjusting the occlusion a little too vigorously. Maybe it's a flaw from the lab. Maybe the patient bit into something and created this. And then when you lean on it and get that catastrophic failure of the crown, that fracture toughness is important. And when you look at a research piece presented at the AADR, you can see on the far right that Emax lithium disilicate, I mean, it's got higher flexural strength, but more importantly, it's got the highest fracture toughness out of all those lithium silicate materials. In fact, by adhesively bonding Emax, you can increase that fracture toughness even more. And we'll explain how that works when we talk about why we want to adhesively bond some of these restorations into place. If we look at the work that Gordon's been, well, it's not Gordon, it's really Rella's been doing up at the Track Foundation. In 2018, they released their newest issue of the report that's been looking at zirconia and Emax in their study that started back in 2009. And I've highlighted a couple columns here, this survival to date. So you can see in the top, Bruxer 2009 has a survival rate of 100%. And cementation failure of 6%, which isn't surprising because we didn't know that much about, you know, the salivary contamination of zirconia back in those days. But if you just glance at the zirconias here, now not all of them have been in for 8 years. You can see a lot of them have just been in for 1 and 2 years, but they're all at 100%. So again, that higher strength of zirconia, you know, is being kind of shown clinically to be true as well. But if we come down here to glass ceramics in this dark pink column, here's IPS Emax, and you can see that its survival, it's also 8 years. It and Bruxer were launched at the same time in this study by Rella at 95% survival rate. That's pretty amazing. And only 5% cementation failures there as well. And you look at something else like a lithium silicate product like the one above it, and even though it's got 10% zirconia, that Celtra Duo, after 1 year that it's been in the study, it's already had 24% failure. So lithium disilicate is not the same as lithium silicate, even though it sounds exactly the same except for those letters D and I. So you want to make sure that when you're choosing a lithium disilicate, you're choosing truly a lithium disilicate. Well, I'm happy to announce that there's a new member to the Emax family. And so we now have, and this is, I understand this is kind of a mouthful, but I'm proud to introduce IPS Emax Zircad Prime. And that's why this is prime time tonight, because this is a prime time material and is worthy of your attention. And so we've got 2 Emax products now. So just to make it, I don't want to say this name every time I refer to this product. So from now on, when I say Emax, just like you guys would when you're talking to each other or to your lab techs, I'm referring to the original Emax lithium disilicate formulation. So if I just say Emax, I'm talking about lithium disilicate. If I say Emax Prime, I'm talking about this next generation all ceramic that I'm going to tell you a little more about right now. So in the beginning, when Bruxer was introduced in 2009, it was a monochromatic puck like you see over on the left. That happens to be a Katana one, but it's just one shade, one translucency material the whole way. They all started off with these 3Y full strength materials, not very translucent, definitely more beast than beauty. And the next kind of jump forward was by Katana, and it's a multi-layered block. And they've done this just by adding pigmentations. And so they have these stacked layers. So you can see there's like 3 distinct layers in that kind of hockey puck that are supposed to be the cervical, the middle, and the incisal. And so with this pigmentation, they've tried to create a difference in translucency. It's a visual effect. It's not true translucency. And there's a definite gradation line. You can see the 3 layers that were poured into that disc when you look at it. But it was a step forward from the monochromatic. It was easier to stain and glaze. And what Ivoclar has done has come up with something that truly deserves the term next generation by coming up with a true gradation. There's literally no layers here. And so as you can see over here to the side, the amazing thing is that it goes from a 3Y, a full strength powder, oxide ceramic, up to a 5Y, a translucent one, at the top with no layers in between, just dispersed, and it's a true gradation from the 3Y up to the 5Y, so you don't have to position your crown at a specific location here so you don't get too much incisal or too much cervical. It's amazing how they've done this, and by blending these 2 oxide powders, these zirconia oxide powders, you've got the high strength 3Y that you have with like a Bruxer material at the margins, and then up at the incisal or the occlusal portion of the crown, you've got more translucent material. So it's truly a mix of different translucencies within one material. I started to ask how they were able to do this because it was always kind of a pipe dream that we used to think about. And they got real nervous, and I just said, look, I don't want to know. I don't want to accidentally say it in my sleep and be killed. So here's those classifications real quick. And again, it's based on how much yttria is in the material. These are the 3Ys. These were the original zirconias like Bruxer. You can see it's 100% tetragonal, as it says here. And so we're able to get that transformational toughening. If you ever saw that video where I hit a Bruxer crown with a sledgehammer, and it doesn't break, it just drives it into a 2x4. That's because of this 100% tetragonal, that transformational toughening. And this 3Y material in Rella's study has proven to be very, very strong. The 4Ys were the next step, where it was 75% tetragonal and then 25% cubic zirconia. It's the same cubic zirconia in like a fake wedding ring. And then the 5Ys was the next generation. These are 50% tetragonal and 50% cubic. So these are getting more translucent as we move from left to right, but at the same time, since the less tetragonal phase that we have in here, the less of an ability for the material to undergo this transformational toughening. And that's why it's genius that Emax Prime has the 3Y material at the margin, so you can prep a feather edge or a near feather edge margin and have that strength there. And then at the occlusal or the incisal portion, have the 5Y, where we don't need the strength because the crown is thicker, but now we're going to have the translucency for a more natural effect. And again, that transformational toughening is what makes us able to hit a zirconia crown with a sledgehammer and drive it into a piece of wood. When a crack starts, the crystals inside, because of the energy of the crack, they change from tetragonal back to the monoclinic, and they close that crack and keep it from happening. Now, it will only do this magic, well, it's not a magic trick, but it'll only do this transformational toughening a couple of times. So if you hit it with a sledgehammer 3 or 4 times, it eventually breaks. But we've never had a material in dentistry with the ability to actively resist these kind of cracks and have that type of fracture toughness numbers. And you can see that's why we get crazy numbers. If you look at the full strength 3Ys, fracture toughness numbers greater than 5, which is kind of amazing. And with the 4Y, you see it drop to 3.3, and then the 5Y, you see it drop to 2.3. And there's now translucent materials where the entire crown's being made out of this 5Y material as well. But that 2.3 fracture toughness number, now you're knocking on the door of the fracture toughness of Emax. So it's kind of like, well, why not just use Emax instead of those materials? And that's kind of where I've always fallen. So the beauty behind what they've been able to do with Prime is this gradient technology. Again, being able to blend the 3Y together with the 5Y and give you the best of both worlds with the higher strength, tougher zirconia at the margins, and then the more translucent zirconia in the occlusal or the incisal surfaces. And so it's not just being done with pigmentation. There is no layering in here. It's a true gradient from top to bottom. And when you see it, you begin to understand what they've really been able to do here through the powder conditioning that they've had to do and how they've been able to fill it. You can see there is a gradient. You know, there's more 3Y here and there's more 5Y. You can just see the translucency of this black line showing through, but there's no distinct demarcations of gingival, middle third, and incisal third. The particles go all the way through here with different translucencies. And typically these materials will sinter in ovens at different times. They take a different amount of hours and temperatures to go through there. And they've conditioned the powder so that they're actually able to have it all happen in one material. And so again, you know, some of the other multi-layers that you'll see will have these three different distinct layers in there, and it's still the same translucency all the way through, even though, you know, the pigments make it look like there's three layers versus what Ivoclar has been able to achieve here. And so again, they can sinter it faster, even though they got the two different layers in there. And your laboratories are getting this into their hands right now. Some have had it, some were part of the testing in the material. And so when you ask for it, you can simply ask for Emax Prime. You know, the labs are well aware of the difference between Emax and Emax Prime. I wouldn't necessarily feel the need to write out the entire name of IPS, you know, Zircad Emax Prime. So they'll be fine with that kind of shortening. So here's an example of an anterior crown made from Emax Prime. And you can look and see how translucent this incisal edge is. And so, yeah, it's a great looking crown, but how about the strength of full strength and durability, full strength zirconia at that margin? That's a great thing to have. You know, dentists really kind of fell in love with solid zirconia because of its strength once it got introduced in 2009. And now you're able to have that strength in a more translucent material as well, without being able to see layers or your technician having to hide those layers. So a big step in the right direction. So when we talk about cementation, education, and protocol, I want to cover a few different things here. These are our primary methods of placing crowns. And, you know, I graduated from dental school in 1988, so everything I did fell under the heading of conventional cementation. We were using Duralon at the time, if you remember that, that product, that polycarboxylic acid cement. And the great thing about it was that it did not cause a lot of post-operative sensitivity, but really all it was, and all conventional cementation is filling spaces. In this case, you know, it's like the mortar between bricks and a wall, but really what we're doing is filling the space between the crown and the prep itself. And so we don't have any kind of bond to the brick or the brick next to it. We're just kind of filling these spaces, and then the mortar, or in our case, the cement, sets hard. Hopefully it's insoluble in saliva as well. And so we're not gaining any retention. We're just kind of locking into this layer and helping to stabilize it. Whereas with adhesive cementation, this is a lot along the lines of crazy glue, a cyanoacrylate. And if you're my age, you remember that guy who would hang from that yellow work helmet. They would bond him to that beam, which looked to be like 40 feet in the air. And that's before the days of green screens. I think that actor was actually hanging 40 feet in the air. And so now we're actually going to chemically interact with the substrate and with the tooth and get some adhesion, but we're not going to use crazy glue, even though patients seem to love to do that for denture teeth and sometimes their own crowns. We're going to use actual bonding agents, things like Adhese and Monobond Plus, to be able to take advantage of some of the stronger methods of bonding we have. So this is a much more interactive and intimate way of connecting a restoration to the tooth. And this works fine for certain restorations and in certain cases. And I'm going to give you kind of a guide, a few questions to kind of ask yourself when you're getting ready to think about how should I put on this next restoration. So when we look at categories of cements, I like to put them in a pyramid, as you kind of see here. And I've got conventional cements at the bottom just because they've been around for the longest. And then we have self-adhesive cements on top of that. And we have adhesive cements on top of that as well. And so as I click here, I'll put some brand names there just so you're a little more familiar with what's going on here. Conventional cements, Reliax, Luting Plus, Fujicem, zinc phosphate. If you go back that far, when I was in dental school, we never used that, but we did have to refrigerate a slab once and mix it once. I'm not sure what that exercise was for, but we did. At least I can say I've mixed the cement. I've never used it. Then we get to the self-adhesive cement. So this is what we would consider bonding. So these two yellow parts of the pyramid are quote unquote bonding. And a lot of these terms are, you know, a little confusing, but this is cementing down here, and these two are actually bonding. So self-adhesive cements are the weakest method of bonding, but you get a higher bond strength than you do with a conventional cement, which is essentially just filling space. So examples of this are SpeedSem Plus, Reliax Unisem, Maxem Elite, things like that from different companies, that products that you've come to use, although you were probably a little confused maybe about the difference between those and true adhesive cements. And these would be like a couple from Ivoclar, Multilink. We're going to look at Variolink Aesthetic tonight, Reliax Ultimate, NX3 from Kerr, Calibre from Dentsply Sirona. These are some of the adhesive cements that have been used over the years. And so pretty much everything, and I guess now we'd have to throw in like an extra little part of the pyramid. Maybe we just add a room, an in-law room over here for like the bioactive cements or something like that. But classically, these are kind of the three, although you know what, that falls under conventional cements too. So I guess we don't need to add on to our pyramid at all. So in general, there's some things you want to keep in mind when you look at this pyramid of cements. And that is, well, first of all, is the number of steps. And so when you're down here in conventional cement land, this is typically as easy as it gets. You know, this is the fewest amount of steps, probably the less technique sensitive, and maybe the easiest to do. And then as you work your way up this, you're going to have more steps, and it probably gets a little more technique sensitive at the same time. But there's a so you might say, well, why do I want to do that? And I'll show you in just a minute why you would want to do it. Now, a retentive preparation becomes less critical if you start at the top with an adhesive cement, so that's nice. And then as you work your way down for a conventional cement, it becomes more critical. So if you've prepped a lower second molar and you've only got 2 millimeters of prep height, and the distal wall of that lower second molar is tilted measly at like 45 degrees because you had to swing the head of the handpiece over so that you didn't hit the upper tooth, that all of a sudden, you know, even though you go, oh, you know, I'm back in an area where it's difficult to control moisture, I think I'd like to use a conventional cement. Well, you need a retentive prep to be able to use a conventional cement, or you're going to have a debond, not a debond, but you're going to have a cementation failure, and it's just going to come off. I guess we could call that a debond as well. That's since the terms kind of overlap. So definitely like the idea of when we have less retentive preps, we're going to work our way up and use a more adhesive cement. Another benefit is as we work our way up the pyramid, the bond strength is going to be higher between the underlying tooth structure and the material itself. So when we have those short clinical crowns or over tapered crowns or areas where we're worried about the long-term retention of a crown, we're going to work our way up this pyramid as well. And when it comes to fracture toughness, that is also going to be improved anytime we adhesively bond something into place. So for example, if you have a ceramic floor tile and you drive a steamroller over it, if you just set it down in the street and drive a steamroller over it, it will crack. But if you take a ceramic floor tile and bond it to the subfloor the way it's supposed to be bonded, and then have an elephant or a steamroller walk across it, it won't break because it takes on the physical properties of the underlying tooth structure itself. And so increasing the fracture toughness of an Emax restoration, for example, can be improved by using one of these two cements, a self-adhesive or an adhesive cement. So that's kind of one of the things to keep in mind when you're doing that. So for example, I think that using something like Emax Prime on a first molar makes a lot of sense. I've got the 3Y strength of that zirconia at the margin and the 5Y in the occlusal third. And somebody might say, but I really like doing Emax on molars, lithium, you know, the lithium disilicate version of it. And that's fine, provided that you can reduce enough occlusally. But then I would suggest that you definitely adhesively bond that Emax crown into place on that first molar. Whereas if you had good retention on that preparation and you were using Emax Prime, I would say, no, definitely go ahead and conventionally cement that, because if you don't need it for retention, the Emax Prime is plenty strong and does not need that increased fracture toughness. So no reason to have to go through those extra steps to be able to do that, because they are, as we work our way up the pyramid, they do become more affected by moisture and things like that. So we need to have better isolation as well. So here's 3 questions to ask yourself when determining which type of cement to use. And this isn't actually in the CE test, but it probably should have been in the CE test, because this is a good thing to remember. And this is kind of just, you don't literally have to ask yourself these 3 questions out loud, but this is what you should be thinking. What am I placing? What type of restoration? You know, is it a crown? Is it a veneer? Is it a bridge? Is it an onlay? Because obviously we have a lot of differences. Veneers, by example, rarely get put on with the same thing we might put a full crown on, because veneers by definition are on non-retentive preparations. And the next thing you have to think about is what restorative material was used to fabricate this restoration. Was it a glass ceramic material, such as lithium disilicate, feldspathic, or lucite, which is IPS Empress? We kind of already said, as we looked at it, that the low strength all ceramics like feldspathic porcelain and like Empress, they must be adhesively bonded into place. They will absolutely fail. They're just not strong enough. And so when we talk about strength like that, we're talking about flexural strength. So any material that has a flexural strength higher than 300 megapascals can be safely conventionally cemented. So feldspathic porcelain has a flexural strength of about 90 to 100 megapascals, and IPS Empress lucite reinforced ceramic has a flexural strength of about 110 to 120 megapascals. So those both need to be adhesively bonded into place. Lithium disilicate, Emax, on the other hand, can be conventionally cemented, or can also be adhesively bonded. It just kind of depends what your goals on and where you're placing it and what the answers to these three questions are. A lot of my friends who live in the CAD/CAM world, they wouldn't consider placing Emax without adhesively bonding it into place. And you can certainly make a good argument for anytime you're placing Emax, using adhesive bonding to be able to increase the fracture toughness. Because why wouldn't you want to have more fracture toughness on that restoration? If it's an oxide ceramic, such as zirconia or alumina, you know that it's plenty strong and it can be conventionally cemented all day long unless you have a prep that's not retentive. And if it's metal, of course, or a PFM, you know that you can conventionally cement that. Again, unless you have a non-retentive preparation. And so if you're paying attention, you will know that the third question is, how retentive is the preparation? For example, those anterior preparations that you're looking at are insanely retentive. If those were Emax crowns, those could absolutely be put on with conventional cement if you chose to do so. If you like the idea of a more aesthetic cement, and the crowns tend to be on the thinner side, then something like a Variolink aesthetic gives you the opportunity to kind of adjust the shade on the fly. That's a more common technique with veneers than it is with crowns, but it's certainly something that could be done. So those preps happen to be retentive enough to go either way. It's just up to you if you want a more aesthetic cement, because typically the adhesive cements do come in a variety of shades, whereas the self-adhesive cements and the conventional cements typically only come in one or two and are definitely more opaque than the self-adhesive and the adhesive cements. The surface treatment of the restorative material. So hydrofluoric acid is going to etch all ceramic restorations. If you're doing chairside CAD/CAM, you're a dentist who does this yourself. If you're not doing this, you are having your laboratory do it for you. So they're going to etch that with the hydrofluoric acid. That's going to remove some of the glass. Remember, we talked about that category of materials, glass ceramics. It's that glass that we're etching from there. And that's going to create micromechanical retention for us to be able to bond to with our silane material. So that's the prime part of etch and prime. And so when we etch it, it's going to be with something like the IPS ceramic etching gel, 5% hydrofluoric acid. And I would say you don't need to know this, but you kind of need to know. I mean, I guess you could know. It helps to know. You'll impress your lab tech if you know that Emax should only be etched for 20 seconds. And then it's up to you to place your silane of choice. I like Monobond Plus just because it works for everything. And so you don't have to have different bottles of stuff and have your staff try to remember, are we using the purple bottle or the green bottle? You can just always use the purple bottle, and that goes on for 60 seconds. But there is such a thing. There's such a thing as under etching, and there's such a thing as over etching as well. And that's why it's a good idea for you to kind of know maybe about the 20-second rule. This is what over etching looks like if you get an Emax crown back from the lab. It looks frosty. It looks too frosty. And this is what a properly etched one, you can just see a disturbance of the pattern here, but it doesn't have this super frosty look on it. So why would a lab tech over etch this? Well, not intentionally, but when I witnessed it at Glidewell, it was just basically they'd be etching a bunch at the same time. And by the time they finished the last one and glanced down at their phone at an Instagram notification they got, and they got back to the first one to rinse it out, it had been 60 seconds. It's more of that and not an intentional over etching, but you actually lose bond strength and it weakens the material as well. We don't want to etch that much glass from here. Hydrofluoric acid will just keep going. You know, it doesn't know when to stop, and that's why it needs to be rinsed out after 20 seconds. We're going to clean the materials chair side. We want to decontaminate these materials, so that's some IvoClean being used. That's a universal restorative cleaning agent that can be used on all crowns. And it's interesting to see, you know, I mentioned earlier about the D bonds of zirconia crowns in Rella's study, and how we didn't realize at the time that that saliva, specifically the phosphate groups in the saliva, would contaminate zirconia and lead to these kind of issues. And it's a much bigger problem for zirconia, certainly, than it is for lithium disilicate. So as you look over here, this is a tensile bond strength if you use multi-link auto mix and monobond plus and cement an Emax crown to a tooth and then pull it off. If you try it in the mouth and contaminate it with saliva and then just rinse it with water, you can see the bond strength drops by about half. Now, this is what most of us were taught to do, right, in dental school. I can't remember ever doing anything besides trying a PFM in the patient's mouth and then doing some air and water on the inside of it. Maybe alcohol in a 2x2, but I don't even remember that. So when it comes to these all ceramics, you can see we're losing about half of our strength here if we just rinse out that crown with water. Now, interestingly, this is phosphoric acid, this little blue bar that you see right here. So phosphoric acid, not hydrofluoric. Hydrofluoric is what the lab used to etch the inside. Phosphoric is what we use to etch enamel. Phosphoric acid does work pretty well on the inside of Emax lithium disilicate. And so you could clean the inside of the crown like that, which is what we've been taught to do for the last 20 years with all ceramic materials, going back to Empress and the days before that. But the highest bond strength that you get is by using the IvoClean, but phosphoric acid is a close second. The interesting thing is we switch over to zirconium oxide, and you see about the same type of numbers, although you get a bigger drop here because of the salivary contamination. But the real kiss of death for zirconia is if you use phosphoric acid inside the crown. And it's only natural to think that it would. I mean, the zirconia crown kind of looks like the Emax crown, just way more opaque. But that's the kiss of death, because the same thing that causes the salivary contamination, the phosphates in the saliva, it's the phosphates in the phosphoric acid. It's all phosphates. I mean, it's right in the name. It's phosphate acid. And so that's going to really contaminate that crown. And these are the crowns that fell off 3, 4, 5 times, where doctors would call back and say, it keeps falling off. And we'd say, well, clean it again and put, 2 coats of the zirconia primer on. Let me know what happens. It fell off again a day later. So the absolute thing we want to do is make sure we don't use phosphoric acid. If you do, if you forget, or your assistant says, oops, I used phosphoric acid, the IvoClean will get rid of the phosphates from the phosphoric acid, just like it will from the saliva. So as you can see here, the IvoClean is kind of a must use for zirconia, and it's kind of a probably really should use for lithium disilicate too. But if you really want to use acid etch here, you can use that and get almost the same result. But for this class of all ceramic materials, IvoClean is a wonderful way to decontaminate these crowns before we cement them into place. So again, it's really simple. After we try it in, rinse and dry it. Put the IvoClean on the inside of the restoration. Make sure you shake the bottle up. You don't want to have any purple streaks. Like sometimes if you haven't used it for a day or two and you squirt it, you'll see little dark purple streaks in there. So shake it up, shake it up, shake it up, put it inside the restoration, leave it there for 20 seconds, and then rinse and dry, and you're good to go. So pretty simple and pretty straightforward. So now we've decontaminated. It's time to prime it. So in the old days, we used to have a silane material for our glass ceramics. And then we'd have to have, something like a zirconia primer for our oxide ceramics. And that would also work for our metal ceramics and sometimes our metal, although there was some special ones there. And so you used to have different colored bottles to do different kinds of things. And some companies still sell those because they get higher, when they test it, they get slightly higher bond strengths with these. But it's become so confusing to remember how to treat these materials and what to cement or bond them with, how to decontaminate, what primer to use. That's why I'm a big fan of the Monobond Plus. And I went to a 3-week-long PowerPoint class, cost me $4,000. And well, there was an effect there you were supposed to see where it slides in and knocks the other bottles out of the way. So there goes that $4,000 straight down the toilet. So the great thing about Monobond Plus is it's got a ceramic silane and a zirconia primer together in the same bottle. I mean, what could be simpler? I wish we could have this for everything in dentistry, where we had one thing that worked for all situations. So if a rep from another company tells you, yes, but the bond strength is 4% less than if you have two separate bottles. Well, the bond strength's way less when you mix up the bottles and use the wrong one. In fact, the restoration falls off. It's simple and straightforward. Just have one purple bottle that you can use for zirconia, that you can use for lithium disilicate, that you can use for metal, you can use for everything. Simple and straightforward. So we've cleaned it. We put the Monobond Plus in the inside, and we allow that to sit for 60 seconds, and then we're going to air dry that. And now we're ready to go. So let's talk about Variolink Aesthetic. This is a great way, a great material to be able to use for IPS Emax lithium disilicate. Again, we're going to help increase the fracture toughness. You can see it comes in a dual cure syringe and a light cure syringe. So depending on how thick your restoration is, if you're worried about being able to cure through it, you've got the ability to use it in either form, which is nice. And so it's at the top of our pyramid. It's adhesive cementation, high shade stability, which is absolutely necessary if we're going to be using this under things like veneers. And so that's where the light cure is typically used. And if we're going under full contour restorations, thicker restorations like crowns, then we're going to be using the Ghoul Cure material. It's got the ibosarin in it, which is what keeps it from changing shades down the road. And both of these come in the same 5 identical shades. I like this current movement in dentistry to not sell us 16 different shades of a material in every single available Vita shade. You know, as dentists, we know that leads to just a huge inventory of materials on the brink of expiring. And then you just have, you know, all these syringes of D4 that you're never going to use until an in-law comes in and you just figure, what the heck, let's try it here and see if it matches the otherwise A2 tooth. It kind of blends if you close one eye. And the interesting thing is that it's not even matched to the Variolink Aesthetic shade system, isn't matched to the Vita shade system, which I really like. And so we're always going to start with the neutral. Anytime we've got a good looking prep underneath it, we know we've got an aesthetic restoration on top. And so we're going to let the light, you know, go through the restoration into the tooth and light it up. You know, that the fact that the tooth acts like a fiber optic bundle. So when light hits it, you know, you can see the gingiva literally kind of light up over the root of the tooth. Not light up, but it doesn't get dark like it do with PFMs, where the metal coping stop the light from going through. So if possible, we want to use the most translucent cement that we can, because that's how human teeth are. There's not an opaque layer of tooth material between the enamel and the dentin. And so we'd like to try to replicate that as best as we can. So there's try-in shades for each of these, and we'll always start with the neutral and see how it looks. And if you're not sure about it and you want to go in one direction, so this is lower value, darker, more yellow, or you can go in higher values. If you're trying in, let's say, restoration 7 through 10, you could try them all in with the neutral. And sometimes I won't even say anything to the patient. I'll leave 7 and 8 in with the neutral, and I'll take the light plus and put it in 9 and 10 and put it back in. And my assistant and I will look and see if it looks any different, if we can tell a difference. Because maybe the prep underneath was a little darker than we thought, and we're getting some show through with the neutral. Or if the patient says something, it makes it easy to do it. So you're not having to guess, well, should I go from an A1 to a B2 here? It's just 2 steps in the warm direction, which is the more yellow, and then 2 steps in the more whitish direction. And so you can, it makes it very easy without having to do any kind of formulas to figure out which shade you're going to be trying to hit. Again, because of that ibosarin, it's got 100% amine-free composition. That's probably going to be one of the test questions, because that's a really important thing to have in a veneer cement. You may or may not know a dentist who has gotten in trouble because of veneer cements changing colors over the years. There have definitely been some lawsuits in that area, and it's kind of a scary thing. And I'm happy to say the Variolink Aesthetic, whether you just immerse it in water for an endless amount of time, which is basically what we're doing when we place veneers in somebody's mouth. We're soaking them in water or exposing it to light, whether it's over curing it or patients falling asleep with their mouth open in the sun. Any of these environmental conditions are not going to cause the shade to change at all. And so you need to be very confident about doing that. So I'd like to demonstrate for you a case where we're going to be placing some IPS Emax, so that's lithium disilicate restorations, with the Variolink Aesthetic. So let me just go through the steps here of how to place. The first step is to remove the temporary crowns. And of course, anytime we're trying in restorations and we want to evaluate the fit, we need to make sure that the preps are nice and clean and free of any temporary cement like you see around some of these teeth. So we're using the Proxit medium fluoride-free Prophy paste to go in and clean up all the preparations. Then we're going to rinse it all off and leave these preps a little bit damp. We don't want to overdry vital teeth as we go through the rest of our procedure. So we've got our Emax crown in hand, and we're taking our Variolink Aesthetic Neutral Shade Try-In Paste. We put it into all 4 of the crowns and seat them in place. And this is a great opportunity to be able to check the margins as well, in addition to having the patient take a look and seeing if they approve of the aesthetics. We're going to check the bite as well and make sure we've got centric stops on the posterior teeth and nice contacts on our anterior teeth. The Variolink Aesthetic Try-In Paste is water soluble, so it's easily rinsed off with some water and air. We're going to leave the teeth damp again. And now we're going to take our IvoClean. We have to assume we've got saliva contamination on the inside of these crowns, so we're just going to place it on the inside. No need to agitate, and leave it in place for 20 seconds. Once 20 seconds has elapsed, we're going to thoroughly rinse the IvoClean from inside the crown and then completely dry the inside of the crown as well, because it's time to place our restorative primer. This is Monobond Plus, and we're going to place this along all the internal aspects of the crown and then leave that in place for 60 seconds, and then use air to blow it all out of the inside of the crown so it's completely evaporated. And now we're going to use a selective etch technique here. So we've got some enamel left around the gingival margins, so we're placing Total Etch, a phosphoric acid, around the enamel margins, and we're going to leave the rest of the dentin surface alone. We're going to rinse that off after 30 seconds from the enamel. And then we're going to blot this dry. We want to make sure that we've got a little inherent moisture on the prep itself. No need to over dry this. We are now going to place the Adhese Universal Adhesive. We're using the Viva pen. You'll notice we're scrubbing or agitating it in place for 20 seconds. This is important to get the highest bond strength. Once 20 seconds has passed, we're going to use air to make sure we don't have any pooling of the material anywhere where we might have an undercut or on a margin or something like that. So once we've thinned out the material, we can now light cure our adhesive at this point, and we're going to cure it for 10 seconds on the facial surface and 10 seconds on the lingual. And you don't have to worry about the crowns not seating. The film thickness of the Adhese Universal is plenty thin. Now we're taking the Variolink Aesthetic. This is the dual cure material in the neutral shade, and placing it inside the Emax crown. And we can go right to the mouth. We're just going to push it in place with a little fingertip pressure, then use the Optroscope pad to hold it down while we do our tack cure. This is a 2-second cure on each quarter of the tooth, so one on the mesial, one on the distal and the facial, and then one of each on the lingual as well. And this will get our cement to its gel state, and you can see how easy it peels off. You want to make sure always err kind of on the side of under curing here rather than over curing. You can always heat it again for a second with the light. And because it is a resin cement and we have an air inhibited layer, we're using our liquid strip glycerin gel around the entire perimeter of the crown, and then we're going to do our final cure, which is 20 seconds per surface as well. Once we've completed our final cure, we use air and water to rinse off the liquid strip from around the crowns, and then we can check the occlusion to make sure that the bite is still accurate after cementation and matches how it looked when we tried the crowns into place prior to cementation. We can use flexible strips to go in and make sure we haven't left any excess material in between the teeth, and we're going to use Astropole cups and points and tips to go around and polish that margin to keep bacterial adhesion down. And since crown margins are susceptible to recurrent decay, it's a good idea to place a fluoride varnish on top of them. This is Fluor Protector S being used around the margins, and then we simply dry it with air. And here you can see a shot of the final 4 Emax crowns in place and see just how nice they look. So to me, that's a great example of where I'm still going to use Emax lithium disilicate, because you might ask the question, well, could you use Emax Prime there? You could, but do you need that much strength? You know, the bite forces in the anterior are 1/3 of what they are in the posterior. So, and the fracture toughness, you know, is almost 2.5 of Emax lithium disilicate anyway, plus I have it on with the Variolink Aesthetic now, raising it even higher. I can just tell you from our experience in the lab, Emax does not fracture in the anterior. Emax lithium disilicate rarely fractures, less than 1% of the time in the anterior. So I'm a huge fan of Emax lithium disilicate for anterior teeth like that. And I'll show you an example of us putting an Emax Prime posterior units into place. So again, when it comes time to cement zirconia, we're able to choose, again, from any of these cements if we want to be able to choose from the cements because of how strong the material is, because of its high flexural strength. Let's look at the self-adhesive cements. If you have used this category before, you might be familiar with how well it works together. And it's a really good choice for something like zirconia because of the high strength of zirconia, and because what it contains inside of here, and the reason why you can use this cement without any kind of primer. So a couple things to keep in mind if you're using a self-adhesive cement. And of course, these are true for conventional cements too. The restoration's got to be high strength, so any 300 megapascal or higher. So we mentioned Emax lithium disilicate, Emax Prime, zirconia, metal. And the tooth's got to have a retentive prep, 4 millimeters in height, 4 to 8 degrees of taper. Okay, that's kind of a wish list of things on a prep. Those are the official numbers. 4 to 8 degrees just doesn't occur in nature. I'd say it's closer to 15 degrees, but most dentists have a decent feel for something that looks retentive or not retentive. But 4 to 8 degrees is what you'll find in prosthodontic textbooks. And the reason that it works and that you don't need a primer is because it's got that 10-MDP, that methacryl oil oxydecyl dihydrogen phosphate, the MDP molecule in the cement itself. And that MDP molecule is what is in zirconia primers as well. And so the fact that it's in the SpeedSem Plus makes it really well suited to be able to use it inside of Emax Prime zirconia-based restorations. And so you don't have to use a zirconia primer with it. So it makes it very efficient to be able to use it by just placing the cement inside of the crown. Now you would think that that name, the 10-MDP, would be one of the CE questions, but it's not, because I don't trust you guys to remember it. And you say, well, Mike, you're just reading it off the slide. What's the big deal? Well, watch this. I'm going to change the slide, and I can still say methacryl oil oxydecyl dihydrogen phosphate. Thank you. So the advantages of using SpeedSem Plus, it's high bond strength. It's ideal for opaque restorations. It's not a super translucent cement because it's not an aesthetic cement, but that makes it easier to clean up and be able to see. Very radio opaque. And again, you don't need any adhesives on the tooth itself. You don't need any primers for zirconia or metal, and it works well with Ivoclean. So it's a great, simple, straightforward way to be able to place Emax Prime restorations, or you can use it for other zirconia restorations as well. And here's an example. Let's take a look at the steps as we're placing this into a mouth with the SpeedSem Plus. So step one is to remove the temporary bridge, lifting it off here with a sickle scaler. And then we need to clean the tooth preparations to make sure that they're free of debris and temporary cement. So we're using Proxit Medium, a fluoride-free prophy paste, to ensure that we've got nice, clean preparations. And once we've achieved that, we will rinse all of the Proxit Medium off the preparations and try the bridge into place. We're holding it in place with a ball burnisher so we can check the margins with a sharp explorer to see whether or not the margins are closed. Once we have tried in the bridge, we have to assume it's been contaminated by saliva. So you're just going to put the Ivoclean inside both units and just leave it in place for 20 seconds. And once 20 seconds has elapsed, we're going to rinse it out. So after you rinse it out, make sure that you dry it as well afterwards, because the next step is to place the SpeedSem Plus cement directly into the bridge. And you can see how easy it is to express it right from the syringe into the bridge. And then we place the bridge into the patient's mouth. And again, we'll use a ball burnisher to push down on the bridge and verify that it's completely seated before we do our spot tack. So we're going to cure for 1 second at each of the quarter line angles. So on the molar is going to be 2 on the buccal and 2 on the lingual. And then we'll move forward to the bicuspid and do that same 1 second tack cure at each of the quarters as well. And you can see with that 1 second, the SpeedSem Plus has a nice gel state and it peels right off from around the tooth. And because SpeedSem Plus is a resin cement and has an air inhibited layer, we're going to place the liquid strip glycerin gel around there and do our final cure of 20 seconds per surface with the liquid strip glycerin gel in place. Once we've cured that completely, we can remove any isolation that we have around the bridge, and then use water and air to rinse off any of the excess glycerin gel that's in place. And because we have a resin cement margin between the crown and the tooth, we're going to use the Optipol cups and points to go in and polish those margins. It'll also get any cement that happens to be on the crown in place. And since crown margins are susceptible to recurrent decay, it's always a good idea to put a fluoride varnish. This is Fluor Protector S that we're placing around those margins to hopefully decrease the chance of any recurrent decay. And you can take a look at that 4-unit oxide ceramic bridge and see how nice that looks and how easy it was to put in place with the SpeedSim Plus. Now, I know most of us probably only do about a third of the steps that you saw in there, but I'm just saying, when a video crew shows up in your office with 3 cameras and starts filming what you're doing, you do it right. And so I did want to take I like taking the opportunity to remind everybody of what we're actually supposed to be doing with these cements and the preparations and all that kind of stuff too, because you know, once you kind of have it down and it's easy to add like one thing in. So whether you're using the Proxit or whether you're using pumice to clean up the preps, it's nice to be able to clean up the preps and make sure we don't have any temporary cement there before we try in restorations. Ivoclar has put something pretty cool together on their website, the Cement Navigation System. So this is for you or your staff members when you have a question, when 2 weeks from now you go to cement something or bond something, you can't remember what it is. And it basically walks you through these questions. So as you can see, it wants to know, what are you going to be cementing to? Is it going to be a tooth? Is it going to be an implant? And we tell you, yeah, it's going to be a tooth. And they say, is it going to be a veneer, an inlay, onlay, a bridge, a crown? We say, nope, it's going to be a crown. And then it asks you, what's it made out of? Is it a glass ceramic, feldspathic, or empress? Is it lithium disilicate? Is it oxide? Nope, it's lithium disilicate. And you click that too, and then it asks, do you have a retentive preparation, or you have this non-retentive preparation? And you say, oh, it's non-retentive, and it goes, ding, variolic aesthetic. And if you say, well, I can't remember that video that Totola showed about how to use it, it will show you those steps. Ivoclar is actually going to make those videos available as part of a video system, video series that I did for them. But it also walks you through with the instructions and the brochures and tells you exactly how to use it. So if you ever forget what the 3 questions are, the Cement Navigation System on their website will walk you right through that. And before we take questions, I want to make one thing clear about referring to Emax Prime as a next generation all ceramic, and why I do that, and why I just don't refer to it as a zirconia product, even though it's this blend of zirconia product, because you can't compare. It's not a zirconia product because you can't compare it to any other zirconia product on the market, because nobody has done what this has done. Some people have made layered shades and things like that, but it's hard to appreciate how difficult it must have been for Ivoclar to be able to blend the 3Y and the 5Y together and have it be in a way that you can't see this transition at all. And so for me, it kind of does what, you know, I've always hoped could be done with zirconia. I've been around zirconia since day one, and you know, I've always hoped for something that was that strong around the margins, but was more translucent at the occlusal or the incisal, but didn't sacrifice the strength down at the margins, where most dentists tend to be thin on their preparations. And so for me, it's an absolute game changer, and that's why I call it a next generation all ceramic, because until somebody else has another product in that class to compare it to, I don't know what else to call this generation besides next generation. So we'll just have to wait and see if the rest of industry follows step, or if Ivoclar's got airtight patents that nobody can get around. We'll have to see, but this is certainly worthy of a request or a prescription from you to the lab, asking for Emax Prime and trying some of these restorations. All right, I think we've got time for a couple of questions. Let's see. Oscar wants to know, do you use Emax for all restorations or prefer zirconia for molars and bridges? Yeah, Emax, IPS Emax, the lithium disilicate, I've always said in my lectures that it's almost the perfect material. It's almost as, if you had to pick a single material, it's pretty darn close in terms of its mix of strength and beauty. And so in 2007, when it was launched, it was like, oh my God, this is amazing. And we were doing it at Glidewell in a monolithic fashion with putting no layering porcelain on it, and it still looked amazing. It was like, wow, something just happened. A change just took place. And then when zirconia was introduced in 2009, it was obviously, you know, 3 times as strong, but left a heck of a lot to be desired in terms of looks. But its bulletproof nature made it that I all of a sudden, and we were having some issues with dentists under preparing from 2007 to 2009. So we were abusing Emax, to be honest, in the lab. We were using Emax where we shouldn't have been using Emax, but we didn't have another tooth color choice. And the dentist just said, do your best. We're like, okay. Well, we should have gone to cast gold or something else, but the dentist refused. So for me, I love zirconia for molars. Because I like being able to cement it there. I like the high strength, and I like Emax everywhere else, Emax lithium disilicate. So to rephrase that, and I don't want this to be confusing, but I like Emax Prime for molars and Emax lithium disilicate everywhere else. As I said in the lab, we just don't see fractures of Emax on anterior teeth. The flexural strength, the fracture toughness are enough in those areas. I mean, if somebody gets hit in the face with a hockey puck, that's a different story. When it comes to bridges, certainly Emax bridges in the anterior. So if you're mesial to a premolar and it's just a 3-unit bridge replacing 1 tooth and you can't do a cantilever, but Emax Press makes some gorgeous looking 3-unit bridges in the anterior. If we're replacing a missing like first molar on the lower, it's easy to say, oh, I'm going to do an all zirconia bridge, but we learned over time that those bridges are a little susceptible to fracture between the ponic and the abutment where those two attach together if the rule of 27 gets violated, which basically says that the connector on a solid zirconia bridge has to be 3 millimeters tall in an occlusal gingival height, and then 3 millimeters wide in a buccal lingual sense. And you can't always get that for lower molars without prepping the adjacent tooth that is super erupted into that edentulous space. And for that reason, I do still use solid zirconia bridges, but I also use PFM bridges. So I don't do single unit PFMs anymore, but I still do PFM bridges because a PFM bridge is the only connector that you could take down to like 1 millimeter by 1 millimeter and know it's going to survive. So for bridges, I still use PFMs in places, and I'll use zirconia in the posterior if I'm not going to violate the rule of 27, and I'll use Emax in the anterior as long as it's only 3 units. If it's a bigger anterior bridge than 3 units, then it's going to be with Emax Prime. Let's see. Hector wants to know, teeth with root canals on the Emax Prime next generation, do you have to use an opaquer as part of the crown? No, I have not seen any opaquers being used for part of the crown. So they're translucent, but it's only in the incisal kind of occlusal third. I don't even want to say third because that makes it sound like there's a demarcation there, but just in the generalized area of the incisal occlusal. So in a general sense, the gingival third and the inside, the intaglio of the crown is that 3Y material, and then up 1 millimeter or 2 from there as well, just based on how thick the crown is. So that keeps any dark shades from showing through there. And so no, there's no need for an opaquer even over a dark tooth as well. In fact, if you had some endodontically treated teeth, let's say teeth number 8 and 9, that's an area where you might have a challenge with regular Emax. You might not be able to use my preferred Emax, which is the medium translucency. You might have to go to the low translucency, and sometimes you might even get show through there. So that's, I just got done saying at the end of that video that I prefer Emax lithium disilicate for anterior crowns like that. But you bring up a good point. If I had dark endodontically treated teeth on 8 and 9, then I'm starting to lean towards Emax Prime for those restorations. You saw how good that one crown looked, and it's interesting. When this material was first available, I had a technician make Emax crowns for me from 7 through 10 and Emax Prime on 7 through 10 as well. And I could not tell. Now, it was in kind of a perfect situation, but I could not tell the difference between the crowns. I had to cheat and look at the inside, and the Emax lithium disilicate, you can totally tell because you can see they've been etched with hydrofluoric acid, whereas Emax Prime and other zirconia materials can't be etched. I mean, you can try etching with hydrofluoric acid, but it's just not going to, it's not going to do anything to it. And so we're not able to etch. And that's one of the reasons why bonding to Emax, we get a higher bond strength of our resin cements to Emax lithium disilicate than we do to Emax Prime. It's because there's glass in Emax lithium disilicate, and there isn't any glass phase in Emax Prime. And that's why the hydrofluoric acid doesn't work. And so now we're just relying strictly on our MDP molecule to get our resin cement to bond to our Emax prime. Whereas with Emax lithium disilicate, we etch some of the glass away during that 20 seconds that the lab etches it with the hydrofluoric acid, and you get the micromechanical retention in addition to the bond from the monobond plus. All right, I just got an alert that our hour is up. I want to thank you guys for spending a little time with me tonight. I love this kind of stuff. I love talking about dentistry, and if I get the chance to see you on the road at one of my lectures, please come up and say hi. I had a great time with you guys. Thank you.